Welcome to this World Animal Protection webinar that will explore with Italian decision makers and stakeholders the unique opportunity Italy has to help end the wildlife trade, both at home and globally. This opportunity was born from the amendment passed by the Italian Parliament in April of this year, asking the government to come forward with a ban on the import, conservation and trade of wild animals to Italy within 12 months. This was linked, of course, to the spread of zoonotic diseases, such as COVID-19, diseases that cross from animals to humans and pose one of the greatest threats to the future health of human populations. Italy is also in an influential position, holding presidency of the G20, which will culminate in the G20 Leaders Summit in Rome at the end of this month. For many years, World Animal Protection has been campaigning to highlight the animal suffering and wider dangers of the trade in wild animals and wild animal products. This trade is driven by demand for the use of animals and their body parts in traditional medicine, as exotic pets, and for use in entertainment. The scale of the illegal trade alone is up there with the global arms trade and the trafficking of people. While much emphasis has in the past been placed on managing the trade in wildlife to conserve species, the reality is that we are losing them at a frightening pace. And the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic has now alerted us to another urgent reason to end this cruel trade. I would like to especially thank LAV for their constant support of our campaign here in Italy, helping us and partnering with us in this event, and for their excellent work in creating the momentum toward a wildlife trade ban in Italy. We're also especially honoured to have amongst the great group of panellists with us today. We're particularly honoured to have Dr. Jane Goodall join us to give concluding remarks at the end of this webinar. The event will be in Italian and English. If you wish to access the interpretation, then please go to the top right of the screen and click on the interpretation tool and choose your mother tongue, Italian or English. You can also ask questions by clicking on the Q&A function as shown on the screen now. Your questions will be collected and may be asked by me to the panelists. This event is being live streamed on the World Animal Protection and LAV Twitter accounts, and you can use the hashtag #EndWildlifeTrade. The event will also be recorded and will be shared on World Animal Protection's social media accounts. So, without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our first eminent presenter, Dr. Clifford Warwick, who is a biologist and medical scientist. His research is specialised in reptilian biology and in human medicine, specialising in zoonoses, the transmission of disease from animals to humans. He's carried out investigations and studies into human use of animals, often in remote jungles and deserts. And after Dr. Warwick speaks, we will see a video investigation from LAV into wildlife markets in Italy, which shows the cruel and often illegal conditions in which these animals are kept. Over to you, Dr. Warwick.
So I'm going to focus today on wildlife trade with an emphasis on the health issues. You'll probably notice that at the bottom of each slide as we go through, or most of the slides, that there are selected references. These are just some of the many nowadays thousands of scientific citations that support the content that I'm about to give you. I couldn't put them all in for obvious reasons, but I have provided a selection of those to Lav and Wap that obviously you can see if you need further information on them. This is going to be a very brief overview. We have 10 minutes or so it will be pretty much a whistle-stop tour. Next slide, please. Okay, so essentially we have with the wildlife trade two main components, a legal and an illegal component. The legal trade is thought to involve somewhere in the region of 15,000 vertebrate species. And that's just the vertebrate species. So that doesn't include the invertebrates, of which there are a very large number of invertebrate animals, and they're very important species ecologically. We know that they are now being recognized for their sensitivities, welfare issues, sentience, and so on. So the vertebrate trade is but a part of it. And around half of that vertebrate trade involves fish of one or another kind. There are about 13,000 species that are involved, for example, in the exotic pet trade alone. Globally, the value is thought, and these are very much estimates, thought to be in the region of 300 billion. One study for the US involving trade found that something like 11 billion specimens, if you go, I think, further about midway down the slide, about 11 billion specimens were involved, and that equated to something like 977 million kilograms of wildlife. So that's wildlife products as well as live animals, about a third of which were pets during a 14-year period. So although we don't know the actual numbers of animals that are involved as individuals, we do know that it's at least hundreds of millions and quite possibly in the billions and so on, such huge numbers of animals on an annual basis. In terms of illegal trade, as was mentioned a little while ago in the video, the wildlife trade is third to the drugs and arms trade. So it's a huge business, as you can imagine, and some sectors, for example, with the reptile trade, between 25 and 44% of that industry is thought to be unlawful. Next slide, please. So this is a very quick overview again of the way in which animals are sourced. So for example, if you look at the bottom of the figure there, you can see that this represents animals being taken from the wild. Those animals are then moved to local centers. For example, these may be organized shops, they may be simple sheds in people's backyards, but those animals will then sit there for a while and may then be supplied to local exporters. Therefore, animals over a wide area become mixed in often quite poor conditions before they are moved to further up the slide to yet greater markets, such as larger exporters again and larger importers. So you get a great mixing of species of highly uncertain origins and health states before they are then distributed through the chains, either as curios, such as killed news of products, or whether they're as pets, or perhaps for the culinary food industries, and then out to people's homes or to the retail industry. So you can see it's very, very difficult to trace back the origins of an animal once it's in this system. Next slide, please. In terms of public health, we have a very big problem, and there are over, so far, as we know, over 200 zoonoses already studied and understood. Most of those are, in fact, associated in one or another way with the wildlife trade. About 60% of human diseases, of all human diseases, have some kind of zoonotic link, so some kind of link back to animals. Approximately 75% of the new emerging diseases have a link to wildlife. Of the pandemics, in fact, something like 19 pandemics in the last recent memory have been attributed to the wildlife trade. And that's caused an estimated 1.4 billion cases of disease over the past century and 87 million deaths. And that's probably a substantial underestimate. If you take just one of these diseases, an actual mild disease. So we're not talking about rabies necessarily, which of course has a high mortality rate, but one of these diseases has a more insidious effect on society, and that's reptile-related salmonellosis, which is a condition, a gastrointestinal condition, usually acquired from pet reptiles through handling and so on. So in the USA, for example, there are something like 70,000 cases per year of reptile-associated salmonellosis just from keeping pets. In the UK, it's about 6,000. And a study in the UK also found that about 27% of all cases of children that were hospitalized with salmonellosis had caught the disease just from keeping their pets. So this is a significant undercurrent of disease even in the Western world. Next slide, please. In terms of animal welfare, it's a pretty sad story. Something in the order of 90% of marine ornamental fishes die before they reach even the high street. So this is a huge number of animals that succumb to trade practices, and the trade practices may involve chemical and even dynamite in order to subdue fish and catch them. About 70% of wild animals die within 6 weeks at wholesalers, and that's the industry's own declaration. And a study in the UK, for instance, found that 75% of pet reptiles die in the home within 1 year of acquisition. Next slide, please. In terms of species conservation, and I haven't focused on this because we're thinking most about the health issues here, and animal welfare is particularly significant to human health because the poorer the conditions for animals, the more likely diseases to spread. So wildlife is a known major driver of habitat and species loss. The wild animals wildlife that's caught is often misleadingly sold as captive bred, and it's becoming increasingly observed that even the more common species thought to be farmed are often augmented via wild populations. The trade for most species is certainly not proven to be safe and sustainable, and for many that are in trade, even common species, it's known not to be sustainable. So essentially, no species is safe within trade. Next slide, please. There are a whole raft of other issues. Don't have much time to go into them, I'm afraid, but agricultural animal health risks are a big concern and a growing concern. Avian influenza, heartwater disease in the USA, Newcastle disease almost everywhere are well-known conditions in animals that have potentially catastrophic effects on agricultural industries. Antimicrobial resistance is a problem that is growing, also partly due to such use as antibiotics in the pet fish industry, trying to keep the fish alive while they're being transported. Invasive alien species, this is an enormous and very costly sector where something in the order of 13,000 species in Europe have been investigated, and just to control these animals and plants, it costs between 12 and 20 billion euros a year. Diseases such as the chytrid disease, a fungal disease amongst amphibians, has now gone globally and is decimating frog populations, and another related disease, a ranavirus with a similar history. And then there are the socio-economic costs. One has to bear in mind that once you add up all these huge costs to the public purse, is there actually really any positive economic side to the wildlife trade? It's a question that needs to be looked at. Next slide, please. So all these problems, instead of going away under the current systems, they're increasing. Now, the causes of that, in particular, have been the way in which these have been approached before, and that's to say using permissive regulation. The CITES is a weak system. The problems essentially have to be present before any actions are taken, and then it is a quagmire of bureaucracy to try and get species protected, by which time they're usually in big trouble, and the traders have simply moved on to another species because there's no precautionary principle built in. All of these problems have, in fact, increased, except where there have been positive lists. Now, positive lists are a well-known approach. They're used throughout almost all industries. Anything that requires permissions and testing is essentially put on a positive list, including individuals such as doctors, drivers, and pilots. Even your local veterinarian has to be on a positive list before he can operate. And so the positive list system is well known. It is an effective system, and it requires that all animals have to be proven to be safe in terms of animal welfare, safe in terms of public health, and not a threat to the environment before they can be traded. And they are better than the current approach of virtually unregulated trade, but they are less effective than bans. Next slide, please. Very quickly, if I can, run through a few examples of the effectiveness of bans, because a lot of people try to criticize bans as being some kind of bad solution. They are a very good solution. If you consider that, for example, in the USA, the red-eared baby turtle trade, which involved something like 13 million animals per year, that was banned in 1975 due to public health issues, salmonellosis, and that reduced the trade to about 200,000 animals within 1 year, and many of those were then clamped down even further. The Canadian trade in the same species was banned in 1976 with similar reductions, very effective. When the USA banned the baby turtle trade, it reduced the numbers of cases of human disease from about 280,000 cases per year down by about 87% within 12 months, just because of the bans. It was very effective. In Europe, we had the Mediterranean tortoises that were previously being imported at a rate of about 400,000 animals per year. When that was banned in 1984, the trade shrank to about 20,000, mostly captive bred animals. Again, in the USA in 1992, a wild bird ban reduced trade in wild birds by about 90%. In Europe, again, with the red-eared turtles, there was a trade in 7 million animals. When that was banned due to the species becoming invasive in 1997, the trade was reduced by about 200,000 animals by 12 months later. And again, a wild bird ban in Europe also had a 90% reduction in 2005. And now many academics that were previously rather skeptical about bans have been somewhat converted to them. Final slide, please. Right. So in summary, bans are actually the normal gold standard mechanism for prevention and control of virtually all social and industrial sectors and problems, whether it's violent crimes, drink driving, fraud. If you think about it, the actual ultimate methodology for stopping these is a ban. They are banned, and that's because bans work. It does not mean that bans will have 100% effect, but it does mean that they are the most effective. And in fact, they have been objectively demonstrated to dramatically reduce and eliminate significant trade in diverse wildlife sectors. And the hyped claims of trade going underground are simply false. It's just not true. When you do have a small underground trade, it's usually either there or the effects are so small in comparison with the former trade that it's a problem worth having. So like all measures, bans have to have good prevention and control. They can be flouted, but it's not acceptable reason for simply not enforcing them. What they do need, however, and I'm sure we'll come to this a bit later on, is very good enforcement measures to ensure that they are properly adhered to. Thanks for that rather speedy tour through the subject.
The Eastern animal markets, the infamous wet markets that have shaken our lives so much in recent years, also exist in Italy under hardly different guises. Wild and exotic animals of all kinds are on display at fairs and expo venues throughout Italy. The needs of the species traded and their relationship with nature here are totally distorted. Animals that could never have any relationship in nature, here are instead in close contact with each other, in conditions of suffering, piled up and forced inside plastic cases or trays. Here, they are not considered as living beings, but as objects, goods. Why do we denounce all this and demand that the trade, possession, and reproduction of these animals is finally banned? To answer this question, LAV's investigative team has performed an undercover survey of what happens in 3 of the largest exotic animal fairs in Italy. Here is the dramatic reality that has emerged.
Non so di che si tratta. Che cosa sono quegli anellini che hanno sulle zampine? Alcuni.
L'anno di nascita.
Ah, ok. Non sapevo perché mi chiedevo, era particolare perché...
Alcuni ci stanno, alcuni li mettono e alcuni no.
Ok, vabbè, tanto è indifferente, diciamo, no?
Non è importante.
Ok, grazie.
These fairs are defended and supported by people claiming they love and respect animals, but the footage shows a very different picture. Stereotypical behaviors or apathy from stress are easily detected cage after cage. The plastic trays used to display the goods, if ever a living being can be considered as such, often have the size of the same animal, desperately trying to escape. We need to restore the balance we have lost with nature, the original home of these animals. We need to protect them from the whims of enthusiasts, curious people, collectors, and the desire for profit of those who say they love them. We need to protect public health, which will always be threatened as long as activities such as these fairs are allowed.
Well, the only pragmatic and political solution to the issue of wildlife markets and the spread of essentially epidemics and pandemics is a ban. Just ban these markets.
So thank you very much, Dr. Clifford Warwick, again for your overview, and Lav for that deeply disturbing insight into what's actually happening here today in Italy when it comes to domestic wildlife trade. Now I want to introduce the panelists for our first session, the first of 2 sessions that we're going to run. This will discuss the amendment that was supported by the Italian Parliament for the government to come forward within 12 months with a specific ban on the imports, conservation and trade in wild and exotic fauna, with a view to reducing the risk of outbreaks of zoonoses. And joining us today, I'm delighted to say, is the initiator of the amendment that led to this action by the Italian Parliament, Senator Loredana De Petris. Senator De Petris is the group leader of Liberi e Uguale, and she is in her 4th term as a senator and has been a member of the Environment and Agriculture Committees of the Parliament in the past, a great champion for good causes. We also have, I'm delighted to say, Dr. Ugo Santucci, who is director at the Italian Ministry of Health and is head of the Animal Welfare Office. His office will have a key part to play in bringing forward this legislation. Then we have Gianluca Felicetti, who is president of LAV, one of the leading Italian animal rights organizations. They were established back in 1977, and LAV brings together activists from all over Italy to promote and bring about a cultural change in the way we relate to other animals. They have campaigned for many animal welfare laws and policies that exist today in Italy, and have campaigned for many years for a wildlife trade ban. We've also worked very hard in partnership with other organisations around the world, including my own, to bring about change. That is our panel. We have got about 25 minutes or so for a brisk and I hope engaged discussion. And I wanted to open Gianluca Felicetti, if you don't mind, with you, and just ask you if you could summarise the state of the wildlife trade here in Italy today.
Buongiorno a tutti, grazie Steve, grazie alla World Animal Protection.
Good morning, Steve. Good morning, and thank you, WAP, for your important initiative that is in parallel with the Italian presidency of the G20 and what is being developed by Italy right now, what is going to come forward in the next few months in terms of regulatory changes. And the real strength of our proposal, which is more than a resolution, more than an amendment. It's rather an article of a law that binds our government within the next month of May to enforce the ban on trade, import and possession of wild and exotic fauna by combining the issues of animal suffering that we all know very well about, which has been a hot debate for the past 20 years, thanks to the media outlets throughout the world and also the Italian media. And we have just shown you some of the surveys that we carried out a few weeks ago with our investigative teams in one of the most important trade fairs where they sell wild and exotic fauna in our country. And this comes hand in hand with the transmission of zoonotic diseases from animals to humans. So, let alone the moral issue of animal suffering. And you may just focus on a selfish need from the point of view of public health. And in order to make these kind of decisions, with our videos that you have just seen, we have demonstrated, we have shown that there's very few controls, not actual controls on the conditions of animals. The fact that they're crowded together with different species, with other exotic animals that can be traded in our country, not only in our country. We also have some ambassadors. We have some symbolic species of these that are ambassadors of this distorted relationship that sees these animals as a no man's land. These are not animals that are protected by the Washington Convention. They don't fall within the category of autochthonous fauna. They are either wild caught or captive bred animals, which show this distorted relationship with animals that is based on possession and their multiplication with the rapid replacement of dying animals, ever since they are caught or bred or transported up until private homes. some species have become the symbol, and in the past few weeks we are bringing symbols in front of our ministers for ecological transition, to our undersecretary who are working on the regulation of in the EU regulation 2016/429 regulation, which is focused on health issues and which represents, with law 53 that has been approved and still has to be enforced. So this is a sort of a bulwark from which you can never go back. We say that we can't go back to where we were. We have the panther chameleon, the barbed dragon. There are so many species that are among the most beloved ones today in these trade fairs. As Dr. Warwick said at the beginning, the states, in our opinion, have a moral duty, and now they also have a legal duty to intervene in order to end this trade, to increasingly and progressively get out of this kind of trade, which has always been senseless for us from the moral point of view, and it has become even more so for everyone today. So in order to not go back to where we were before, and to say that we've learned something from the COVID pandemic, otherwise that would be really foolish on our part as humans. It would mean self-destruction. So what we need to do is to enforce this ban, and Italy can become a symbol country. And actually, Italy is one of those that suffered, was more hardly hit by the COVID pandemic.
Thank you, Gianluca. Thank you very much for those comments and the work you've been doing on this issue. And I take your point that this is an article of a law that needs to be implemented, needs to be enforced. And Senator De Petris, you brought this amendment forward. It's been adopted by the Parliament. Did you expect your fellow senators to support the amendment when it was put through? What do you think was the primary reason for getting such a radical piece of legislation through the Parliament?
Tanto grazie per l'invito.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me, and thank you, WAP, for organizing this webinar. I would also like to thank Love for their work on this amendment that we have developed in close collaboration with them. You asked me if I expected it. Well, our work was also focused on trying to convince our the fellow senators. At the beginning, they were not quite convinced, but I need to thank the then Undersecretary for European Affairs of the previous government, who understood what is the real purpose of this amendment. The amendment was also approved by other colleagues, but I have to admit that at the beginning there was a lot of resistance on their part. And I also have to say that some senators from the Lega are still trying right now to submit amendments to suppress this regulation, and they even put forward and draft legislation to eliminate our amendment. Because the Lega believes that this is too strong from the point of view of an immediate ban. Our amendment has a very clear objective, and it is also focused on the cause of the pandemic. So it is focused on the connection with the attack on ecosystems and on animals, which has almost totally been forgotten by the general public and also by the media mainstream. They just talked about this at the beginning, but the data they showed, that Professor Warwick showed earlier, are no longer seen and are no longer shown to the public anymore. This is why we have to continue with our awareness raising campaigns, the 200 zoonoses, which are also connected to the animal trade, are important scientific data that have to be made very well known to the general public as well. And our law has to be transposed by the government, and so the government has to enforce it in the regulation that deals with the transmissible diseases, the diseases that are transmitted from animals to humans. So this has to be transposed in our health regulations. Many are opposed to the idea that there can be a ban, a total ban for commercial reasons. And, sometimes they're hypercritical enough and they say you don't solve all issues with bans. I think that's what we need, certainly, is also an awareness raising campaign. But the most important instrument that we have today is the ban. The regulation is very clear because on one side it envisages restrictions on wildlife trade through a sanctionatory system, and on the other side it clearly calls on the government to put forward explicit bans for the import of wild and exotic fauna. We know that there's a very strong economic interest at the basis of these trades. The trade of living animals is ranks third in international scenario. And we know that there is going to be a lot of pressure in order to avoid this ban to be enforced. As Mr. Felicetti said earlier, this is not just a matter of ethics towards the animals and their well-being, but now it is also a matter of protecting human health. Otherwise, we risk having new pandemics in the future. Because if you put into contact species that are not supposed to be into contact with each other, and then putting all of them in contact with humans, this can easily lead to the spread of new pathogens, of new viruses, which are very dangerous for humans. Of course, this is not going to be an easy task. I see Mr. Santucci and myself and others who worked on the amendment will put a lot of pressure on the government in order for them to enforce this regulation and to enforce the ban, of course. But this is something that has to do with the health of our citizens. Italy has been hardly hit. It was the first country in the Western Europe to be hit by the COVID pandemic. This is one more reason why we should be the first country to enforce this ban. It has also got to do with environmental sustainability altogether. We have a number of issues in terms of biodiversity loss at the global level, and this impacts strongly on the life of the planet and also the reproduction of life. So we also have an environmental target, which is very important for the health of our citizens.
Thank you, grazie mille. Thank you very much, Senator. I'd like to just build for now on the Senator's comments, and particularly looking at how do we have, in Italy, how do we get an effective ban in place? And we talked about awareness raising, but also the enforcement of a ban. And I'd like to turn to Dr. Santucci from the Ministry of Health, and just get your response to the Senator's comments. What was your reaction to the Parliament's move to ban the trade and the need for that ban? And also, once that law is in place, because we know that we'll push aside the opponents from the League or anywhere else to get this ban in place. Once that new law is in place, what can you do to ensure that it is actually enforced?
Grazie, buongiorno a tutti.
Well, thanks a lot and good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me and for giving me the opportunity to talk about some of the things that are the focus of our institutional activity. This has to be a government-led regulation, so it is imperative for us. This is an article that is focused on the different aspects, not only animal protection in general, but also the protection of pets. It's about training, education. We need to educate the world, the society, and I'm the head of the Animal Wellbeing Office for all kinds of animals in farms, during the transportation, slaughtering, experimentation testing. And I think that I'm the right person, at least I hope so, for this question. So how are we working? We're working for this regulation to be enforced, but there's something to do before that, because after 50 years, I've been dealing with this sector for 5 years, and for 30 years, I've been working in the animal health sector I met the senator several times. She's a very serious person. She's a very committed person. She has a great background, and so she's a guarantee for us. But also the health ministry has to do a lot for this. I have to say that currently Italy is the only country in which veterinary services depend on the Ministry of Health. In all other countries, they depend on the Ministry of Agriculture. Therefore, I'm very proud of this because it's easy to work on the fight against zoonosis, but we have to have a comprehensive approach. At the end of the 1990s, we went through a large influenza pandemic. We destroyed 17 million birds, and we know very well what we're talking about when we talk about zoonosis. Of course, the COVID pandemic forced us to better understand what we talk about and to understand that we have to be prepared for the One Health approach. By this, I mean that on one side, we have to say that from the point of view of EU regulation, we are totally disaligned. We live in a world that is based on community regulations. Therefore, for us, it's a bet. It's a challenge. It's a real challenge. We really want to try to have the correct approach. What do I mean by that? I mean that we've been working on this for a long time, but there is no regulation on the identification and control and handling of pets like cats, dogs. If we look at Annex 1 of Regulation 4009 of 2016, there's Annex 1 with the Part A and Annex B that is about pets like amphibians, reptiles, invertebrates, mammals, birds. So it's a great challenge. And I have to communicate this concern in drafting a substantive law and not just a sort of ads. This is not an ad. I mean, those who respect animals, and I can say that because I work with animals, we have the ethological respect. So we have to get rid of selfishness of men. We need to educate humans for this. And in Law 53, there are all the ingredients for that, but it is clear that we can't develop such a complex project in a short time. So on one side, we have health experts, and on the other side, there is us who want to protect animals from the ethological point of view. We've been working on this for a long time. I think that Italy is a promoter of these initiatives. We're trying to create a census of pets, dogs, cats, and ferrets. No one wants to be willing to block animal trade. And during the COVID pandemic, actually, this trade has increased dramatically. Also, facilitated by legal trade, for example, the facilitated by pet trade. And Italy is the only country that recorded Brucella canis outbreaks, which is a disease that only exists in European countries. Therefore, the approach is to identify the facilities, the centers we want, because we can't just do it all of a sudden. We need to face with an existing reality where we have facilities that are out of control. We have some people that have people get together and because in order to produce new species, So we have to force all the facilities having animals to be registered. We want also to identify animals individually, so that when we can get together with the other ministries, we can see how we can regulate the wildlife ban. What is also important is the management, the handling of animals. This is important because not all the people who have pets manages these pets correctly. So we need the traceability of transportation and also of the vehicles by which these animals are transported. In conclusion, this is a real challenge. We're going to really strive to take this challenge. We will have very soon a draft regulation with all the stakeholders, and we will certainly find the best way to govern this world, which is very complex, I can assure you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Santucci. Appreciate the challenge that faces you in the coming years as you take on the enforcement issues here. Just being mindful of time, we've got a probably overly ambitious agenda in front of us, and we have to move to another panel very shortly. I just wonder if I could ask one question and get a brief response from each of you. So do you feel, perhaps Gianluca, you could go first, we're going in the same order, but do you feel that Italy, the Italian authorities, are really taking the pandemic risks around wildlife trade seriously enough? Or have they, as the Senator suggested, have they started to forget where COVID came from and probably where the next pandemic will come from?
Penso che quanto sta avvenendo nel nostro
I think that what is happening in our country is very similar to what is happening elsewhere, especially in the north part of the world. Everybody is busy with the vaccines rollout and the different responses that you can give a posteriori when the damage has already been done. I think that we can very hardly draw the attention on the prevention issue. Therefore, I believe that this ban could represent one of the best vaccines that is also available for the entire world without any differences, without any inequalities. Of course, this cannot be a panacea for all evils. We also have to envisage other solutions. We find it hard to call for the attention of politicians in our countries about the urgency of working on this aspect, especially after the everything that we have just experienced and that we are still experiencing with the COVID. This is a human side that is there, and we repeat every day that we need to carry out prevention against pollution, against animals ill treatment, which is one of the best weapons for our health. And really hope that the government is going to put an end on all of this and is going to enforce the ban. As for the cultural change, we're going to need more time, but we will do it eventually.
Thank you, Gianluca. And Senator, perhaps again, just a quick response to the same question. are we taking it seriously enough? Is the Italian government taking the pandemic risk and that link to wild animals seriously enough, or are we forgetting?
Ma ovviamente il governo è stato molto concentrato, insomma, nel mettere in ritardo.
Well, the government has been very much focused on trying to repair, well, is focused on the vaccination campaign. As I said earlier, not only this is not only true in our country, but it is the general cultural prevention that is quite lacking. And also in the specific case of COVID, at the beginning, they've talked about the origin and the close connection between the pandemic and the zoonosis, and also the ecosystems, but also all the awareness raising campaign is connected to trying to save lives. Our health system starts from
our system starts from a reform of the that put in the first place prevention, and information campaigns and scientific data allow us in such sense. However, we're now facing a situation whereby we live in a globalized world, and if prevention is not effective, then bans have to be introduced. They must be introduced. I cannot see any other tool but this, if we want to apply these norms and have them complied with. And of course, this is also true for other sectors, and this is the same issue that we raise on the climate changes, on the prevention should mean intervening with the mitigation policies, and this should be our daily work. But prevention should be supported, and I repeat, also in Italy, medias are actually hostile in this sense, especially on the climate change, but also on this. We have, whether the law, we have regulations, we do information and awareness campaigns, and we also spread detailed information supported by and backed by scientific data. And we do have the ban as the main tool, and I think, we cannot do without it. Thank you very much.
Just draw to a close on panel one now with my sincere apologies, Dr. Santucci, to you. I've just got to hit a deadline at the end of all of this. So I'm going to have to move from here into the second session, but a huge thank you to all my panelists, to Gianluca, to the Senator De Petris, and of course Dr. Santucci. I think I at least am given some real hope that through the legislative actions being taken by the Italian government, we may see the first ban put in place that will tackle the issue around wildlife trade and that link to pandemics such as COVID. And there have been many more, and there are more to come in the future, as Dr. Clifford Warwick said, unless we get a grip on this. Now, I'm going to move us on from there to the second panel. And I'm going to just introduce first our panelists. This panel actually is going to move out from a sort of Italian domestic view to a global perspective. So the panel will be discussing the Italian presidency of the G20, the 20 governments, of course, that come together as part of the G20, and how the G20 can focus on the issue of wildlife trade and the spread of zoonotic disease. We're seeing what Italy is trying to do. We need to see action from the G20. Last year, the G20 agreed to, quote, develop a list of wildlife species and conditions under which they could present significant risks of transmitting zoonoses, and to issue guidelines towards mitigating these risks. Now, this has not yet been done. And I have to say, as an organisation, we're deeply concerned that the wildlife trade issue and this link to zoonoses does not have the prominence that it should have. So to discuss this, we have the following speakers. We have Kelly Dent, who is Director of External Engagement at World Animal Protection. Kelly has 25 years experience championing change for animals, people and the planet, and has worked on climate action, human rights and development. She leads the engagement with governments and the private sector on our campaign to end the wildlife trade. When I talk about the wildlife trade, I mean both legal and illegal. We then, I'm delighted to say, have Nicoletta Dentico, who is a renowned journalist, writer with expertise in global health. She was director of Médecins Sans Frontières here in Italy, and also worked at the World Health Organization. She currently leads the Global Health Justice Programme at the Society for International Development. And our third panelist is Simona Ceravesi. She is a social scientist with over 15 years of experience in the global health sector. Her focus has been in public health, nutrition, and effectiveness. And in 2020, she was appointed as advisor on global health at the Prime Minister's office in Italy, under the Sherpa G20 office. So she's got a significant role to play with colleagues as we head into the Rome summit at the end of this month. So we're going to, again, do our best to get straight into the issue here in the time that we have. And first, I'd like to ask Kelly just to give us a quick summation view of the state of the wildlife trade today, and what progress there has been up to now in restricting wildlife trade globally.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everybody. So, as we've heard, the wildlife trade's a ticking time bomb for deadly and infectious diseases. And this is why World Animal Protection is calling on the G20 to end the trade between countries in wild animals and wild animal products that are involved in non-essential global commercial trade. So where we are now, we heard in the introduction that last year the agriculture and water ministers did acknowledge of the G20 the connection between human and animal health, and they called for that link to be acted on through mandating the World Organization for Animal Health, the WHO and the FAO to draw up a list of wildlife species at risk of spreading zoonotic disease. But as we heard, this is yet to be mentioned. Since then, we've seen a slew of reports come out, including one earlier this year by UNEP, which is around making peace with nature. And that found that a post-COVID world needs to address the issues of habitat destruction, wildlife trade, and other human and nature interactions that increase our exposure to zoonotic diseases. So moving forward to, and we heard a range of other authorities come out with various calls. So moving to this year, what we've seen is the Italian government, in their role as president of a chair of the G20, we've seen them build a One Health call to action. And this was noted at the recent September Health Ministers meeting. Now, this call to action acknowledges the significance of animal health to human health and the risks of human-animal interaction and the wildlife trade. And these are important developments. They're small steps forward. They're important developments because they show that the G20 can deal with these issues if it has the political will to do so. They also understand the importance of pandemic prevention and the need to address the issue of animal welfare and human health to prevent pandemics. What we've also seen, though, is countries basically a couple of both years running, we've seen disagreements on taking these really critical issues for the world forward. And these disagreements have primarily, but not exclusively, been between the US and China. Now, while disagreements occur, they should not stifle progress. So, I mean, we think that, the progress to date has, the steps have been good, but there needs to be much more happen. And I think that the G20 presidency can and should do more to actually look at making sure these really critical steps they've made are more than noted as they wanted them to be, that they are actually endorsed. So I think that's a bit of a very quick romp through where we are now to date, and look forward to discussing that further. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Appreciate you taking us through that quite concisely. It's a very complex issue. I wanted to turn to Nicoletta Dentico next, if you don't mind. And just thinking about the G20, it's just about 3 weeks away, 4 weeks away. What role do you feel the G20 could and should play in helping to end the global wildlife trade and obviously tackling that associated zoonotic risk to human health?
Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you all, and thank you for inviting me to this very important meeting, and because it actually, I think, inspires action on my side at the global civil society kind of community to join forces more closely between those that are looking at the veterinary health and those that are looking at human health. I think we really need to bridge gaps in that respect, and I will make commitments with you later on this. Well, what could the G20, what role could the G20 play or should play? Well, everybody now expects everything to happen inside the G20. We are in such a context of the broken threads of multilateralism at this stage that everybody thinks that things will happen maybe when you have 20 countries around the table instead of 184 or 96. It depends on the organization that you're in. And I think we should beware about this trend of placing all issues within the G20. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this precisely for the example that was mentioned earlier on by Kelly. There was a list, a species list that actually appeared in the Saudi Arabia presidency of the G20. There's no such a list in the Italian presidency-led G20. I mean, this list has disappeared. So one main question that I would like to raise, and I'm really interested in the governance issue here, is can we rely honestly on a mechanism that changes year after year? I mean, where is the assessment of the coherency and the continuation of the priorities that are shifting from one presidency to the other? Of course, we are in a very, very special time now. We are in a pandemic time, but the Saudi Arabia seemed to have, the Saudi Arabia presidency seemed to have captured this priority more than the Italian presidency has, notwithstanding the very important actions that have been carried out by the Italian parliament and that will have to be implemented by the Italian government. So here is what has happened with this list. I think Professor William Thibault has told us how important positive lists are, and so we want to have the list. Where is this list? And if it comes, this list, it comes pretty late in the Italian presidency year, it must be said, and critically also declared. Notwithstanding the very declamatory, language of the G20 events and documents that have come from those events that actually devote a lot of attention to One Health approaches. I'm referring to the Rome Declaration of the 21st of May with the Global Health Summit, and later to the Rome Pact of the health ministers in early September. Of course, there is a lot of language. I mean, in the Rome Pact, in these 11 pages of the health ministers, there is one section on building One Health resilience. However, making diagnoses and sharing principled statements, yes, is important, as Kelly said, but is hardly enough. It's really not enough at all, because we are in the time that we are, pandemic time, because there is an urgency of the timing that cannot actually, die or be nullified in declamatory, almost metaphysical concepts such as transformative resilience, catalytic investments, science-based holistic approach. What does that mean? There's enough science-based knowledge, and you have shared it with us today, that we need a different route. There is, a clear in the documents that the G20 has produced, the word regulatory, the word regulation is mentioned nowhere. It all comes down to investments. But here we are talking with the need for a new development model that the G20 does not at all tackle. And unfortunately, it's a pitiful remark that I have to make. Even the One Health approach is a health biomedical dimension that prevails. It is, sharing of data. It is coming down to surveillance. It is coming down to, of course, important aspects that have to do with zoonotic events. But it comes at the end of the equation, and it never comes at the beginning of the equation. The system that is actually producing the devastation in which we are. Of which, while the life trade is, after the disasters that we produce to the habitats, the second biggest structural event that produces zoonotic situations. It's already been said. So, yes, the G20 could be a catalytic place to produce change, to also maybe overcome some of the tensions, the geopolitical tensions that exist in between the US and China. But of course, it must be remembered that China also introduced in 2020 a ban on consumption of wildlife animals. And there has been a survey among the Chinese society where 90% of the Chinese people would be in favor of a ban. So there are conditions that also evolve with the pandemic situation. Well, it doesn't seem to me that the geopolitical war between China and the US is actually, is still a factor in the G20. It's not solved in a smaller group. And I think the Italian presidency, for all the reasons the Senator De Pretris mentioned earlier, because we were the epicenter after China, because we are still the country that has had the highest toll in proportion to the population globally, we should exercise a leverage that I personally don't see. However, the G20 is also always referring to a very chaotic governance system, even within the UN system. all the issues that we are tackling today are suffering from what I personally call the bubble syndrome. The bubble syndrome is that in managing the system change that we want to produce in relation to animal health, human health, ecological systems, and the protection of the habitat, so the prevention, the preparedness, and the response to the next pandemics, we have a structure of 3 UN organizations plus 1, plus we have the leaders, the global leaders to deal with AMR. Then we have the high-level expert panel on AMR. Then we have, you name it. The G20, a kind of a pathology that I've recorded in the G20 this year is that whoever states in the first sentence that they want to strengthen the current multilateral system, and particularly the very weakened WHO, in the second part of their intervention, they present yet another initiative, yet another creation, yet another body where the same issue should be tackled. And mainly it comes down to finance. At the end of the day, it will be the financial agenda to define the health priorities in this year, I mean, in the Italian G20. One final remark, because I think it's important. I am totally in favor of a ban. I think, as William said at the beginning, a ban has a clear science-based evidence that it is the solution. However, I wonder, how can we manage a global ban on wildlife trade, as we should, in a system where the role of governments is shrinking by the hour? Because the G20 and G20 member states continue, as I said, to talk about investments rather than policies and regulations. And on the other hand, they all advocate for the enhancement and the facilitation, the leveraging of the power of the private sector in dealing with the global problems. Here we have global businesses that cannot be, and global tragedies that cannot be dealt with the inclusion of the global private sector players in the arena of policymaking. I think this is a major challenge for all of us who want a global ban. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. And I'm sure one or two other panelists may want to come back on some of your comments if we have some time a little bit later. I'll just so we complete the circuit, I'd like to head over to Simona Ceravesi. And Simona, I was reflecting before this meeting on, I guess, the warnings that the world has had before. I mean, this is the sharpest warning through COVID-19. But I was looking back, it was a piece of research that was done back in 2017, where they were looking at particularly the SARS outbreak. And obviously, as Clifford Warwick mentioned earlier, we've had plenty of crossovers previously: Ebola, bird flu, MERS, SARS, Zika virus, HIV. I mean, there's a point at which you think, when is the world going to sit up and understand that we have to tackle the wildlife trade and this interrelationship between people and animals, and the sooner the better, or it's just going to get worse. But it's looking back at that study, and it was a study done in 2017. They talked about the SARS outbreak, and they concluded that, to quote, the presence of a large reservoir of SARS-CoV-like virus in horseshoe bats, together with a culture of eating exotic animals in southern China, is a time bomb. 3 years later, that time bomb exploded. From your point of view, do you think that the Italian presidency, and do you think that G20 governments really are taking this issue seriously enough? And what sort of action do you believe we may see coming out of the meeting at the end of this month?
Thank you very much for these questions, and thank you for inviting me to this event, which I think is very important, and there is not enough space yet about this topic. I'm sorry, I have this problem this morning with the alarm systems in my neighborhood, so I'm very sorry. I'm very.
It's okay.
Quite. So I'm so sorry for this. Anyway, yeah, we were really welcome these invitations because I think it's a topic which is quite relevant within the preventions and preparedness work against the pandemic, but not only against the actual pandemic, but against any future pandemic threats or any future health emergencies. And in terms of looking at the overall at the G20 process, what we have tried to do, because of course, I think you have also to understand that there is a membership, and you know, I mean, the process is that you start with some ideas, you start to put on the table some issue that you consider relevant, and then of course you start to negotiate with a membership of 20 countries with different needs, different priorities, especially at the regional and the national level, and especially in this particular historical moment where the pandemic was in a way affecting and working in a different way, you know, in each country. So one of the things that we really, I mean, put as a priority, and this was not from the Prime Minister office, but this was from the Ministry of Health, was to underline the importance of putting at the top the One Health approach, the holistic One Health approach. And so this is the reason why we start to have these collaborations with the Tripartite Plus, and we start to draft this call to action. And we also start to negotiate with the membership. And at the beginning, I should say that since, I mean, this is the topic of our conversations, there was the strongest, narrative about the wildlife trade, because I was, you know, preparing this, my interventions here, I was looking back to the versions, because of course I have a collection of versions in my files, and I was looking at the language about the wildlife trade, and it was quite, I mean, strongest. And following, of course, as you quoted, the ministerial G20 agricultural declarations of the last year. But unfortunately, you know, we revise accordingly with the needs, as I said, of the membership, the language. And we have this language that you mentioned in the call to action. In any case, oh, thanks God, because even for me, concentrate is very difficult. Yeah, I'm very sorry for this. And so by looking at the call to actions that unfortunately, by the way, was not welcomed by all the countries. And this was really one of our, our main priorities and main item. I think that at the end, it's a quite good document that was not actually done before, and where you can find a sort of action point that the government should do. And there is also a strong, by the way, regulatory aspect, not only the financial aspect, which I think are very important. And the fact that the call to action was not and was not welcome, you have also to, I mean, a reflection should be done, and this, of course, it's quite it's important, but it's also reflecting where the G20 members are. I mean, you know, they are quite positions in a different way. And by the way, concerning the One Health approach, what I would like to say is that the G20 Italian presidency was really trying its best to get a sort of unified and uniform language about One Health, also in other declarations. And this was, I think, it's quite a successful point, because the One Health approach is quoted in the declarations of Matera, which is related to the sustainable development, and also to the agricultural and the environment declaration, and also, of course, in the health declaration, which I think it's a good point. Of course, we know that the One Health approach is not something new. But we know that there is no enough yet coherence, and I agree with Nicoletta, by the way. There is no enough coherence in the way in which the G20 members will implement, this kind of policy, like the One Health approach. And another thing that I would like to highlight is also that One Health approach was also mentioned in the Global Health Summit, and also among the principles of the Global Health Summit, which I think also is a good point. And also it is mentioned, and here we are going beyond the G20 membership within the World Health Resolution 74.7, and which I think is also, also this is a good point. By looking at the topic of the wildlife trade, which should be one of the, most important component of the One Health approach, I think that once, at least, this is my thinking, once you have, and we have already on the table that we align the importance of the One Health approach, I think that we have to work more deeply in making this One Health approach operational, because this is now the gap. Because of course we can talk and we can say, okay, the call to actions, it's a good document, but at the end we have also to engage the countries to implement the One Health approach. But maybe emphasizing, some of the things that the 4 countries are priorities, like for instance, the wildlife trade, instead of, for instance, the food system sustainability, the biodiversity loss, the consumptions of land. But even by looking at the operationalizations, I think it's also a matter of responsibility, also of at the regional level, and also of each country, because of course there are some countries within the G20 membership which are quite hesitant, to some of the aspects of the One Health approach. Like for instance, when we were talking about to engage the tripartite plus, which is not yet official because the tripartite is composed by the 3 organizations, and UNEP is not yet officially part of the tripartite plus, it was not really very easy. Because there are countries like, for instance, in South America, that they don't agree to have the environment component within the tripartite plus. So there are all these kind of issues that should be continued, by the way, to discuss even in the next presidency. And even on this, I totally agree with Nicoletta that I'm talking from the Prime Minister office in Italy, but we are quite supporter of the multilateralism, and we would like also to see coherence, and this is the reason why we are also discussing with the next presidency, which is Indonesia, and which is not always easy. And the last thing that I would like to say is that looking at the joint ministerial meeting, health and finance, and look at the leader summit, we are now working on more on the governance of the global health, and we are working on a proposal of a global health and finance board. And we are in the middle of the negotiation, which are not very easy, as you can understand, as you can imagine, are not very easy. And one of the things that we should realize is that there is, on one side, there is a strong need from countries, not only the membership of the G20, but overall the countries, to respond to the current pandemic. So we have a very huge pressure to respond to this huge to the current pandemic, because we know that, for instance, in the African countries, only 2% of the population is vaccinated. So it's really very, a shame, and is a very huge gap that we have to try to cover. On the other side, our presidency, our G20 presidency, by highlighting the importance of the One Health approach, is also, we start since the beginning to try to engage the membership about the things that is important also to reflect on prevention, to be more prepared to the next pandemics. And this is the reason why we are trying this review of the governance, where of course WHO has a crucial role, to make sure that also the One Health approach is not lost, but we will keep it as a part of the inheritance for the next G20 presidency. But of course, as I said at the beginning, it's something ongoing and not always very, very easy. So thank you, and over to you.
Simona, thank you so much. I think we've just set ourselves up for a deep discussion that we could have over the next hour, but we don't have time. So I'm going to look at this conversation as a taster, and I would love us to come back and do a deep dive into this, maybe post-Rome, post the G20, when we actually see what's happened and we look at the path that we take forward. So I'm going to be the most unpopular moderator in the world and ask Kelly just to do a response to the conversation contributions from Nicoletta and Simona. And then I'm going to have to introduce Jane Goodall before I lose her. Okay, Kelly.
Great, thanks. Yeah, certainly could have been a discussion that we could have had for a very long time, I believe. Lots of really good points there that I really wanted to respond to. But in kind of the interest of brevity, I think that coherence is really important, and it will be important that Italy does work really closely with Indonesia and then also with India, who has the presidency in 2023. Absolutely agree that, you know, we can't load the G20 up too much and can't expect everything of it. However, it's hard to imagine a greater world threat at the moment in terms of basically health and animal welfare and what we've all been living through than COVID-19. I think the Italian presidency is definitely uniquely placed, you know, to be on the right side of history at this year's G20, and really can commit to try and bring countries along for a global ban on wildlife so that we can look at preventing the next pandemic, which is really critical, and also to end the suffering and exploitation of wildlife. And of course, it isn't just the role of the G20. I mean, it is the role of the other institutions. We've also mentioned the bans that we've seen in China on terrestrial-based mammals, consumption of those. We've seen of terrestrial-based mammals. We've seen bans in some other countries. Of course, national bans, regional bans, global bans. We need to be looking at all of those, and we need to be looking at how we can work with the various governments, bodies, etc., right around the world. And we need to keep animals in the wild where they belong. Thanks.
Nice final words there, Kelly, and a lovely link actually to our final speaker. Before I do go to Dr. Jane Goodall, I did want to just thank everybody because Jane is going to sort of close this out. I'm not going to, you'll be delighted to know I'm not going to come back on after it. So that will be the end of the presentations and the webinar. So I just want to thank all of our participants and panelists for contributions today. It was a taster of such a huge, complex and unbelievably important issue, both from an animal welfare and a human health point of view. Thank you again to Lav for your cooperation, your partnership, friendship in creating this event. And certainly we as an organisation will continue to fight for an end to the wildlife trade. You can find out more, of course, got to do a plug here, at www.worldanimalprotection.org. And now I'm delighted to introduce the founder of the Jane Goodall Institute and UN Messenger of Peace, Dr. Jane Goodall, DBE. Thank you.
Well, hello to everybody. I think it's good day or something, about the middle of the day, isn't it? And thank you for inviting me to say a few words. It's pretty hard to end something when you don't actually know what anybody's going to say. And so the best I can do, I've jotted down a few notes, and I'd like to sort of move this conversation a little bit wider. And so the first thing I want to say is that my years in the rainforest studying chimpanzees in Gombe taught me how everything is interrelated. All of these problems that we face today, they're all interrelated. And fortunately, there are groups of people and organizations tackling the different aspects. But the One Health uh, program that we're talking about to prevent pandemics, for example, it's sort of wider than that. It depends on the relationship that we have with the natural world, because it's our disrespect of the natural world that has led to not only this pandemic and other pandemics by our disrespect of animals, but it's also led our disrespect of nature to climate change and loss of biodiversity. We actually need to remind people that we depend on the natural world. We depend on it for clean air, water, food, shelter, everything. But what we depend on is healthy ecosystems. And if you take a forest ecosystem and a species disappears, it's like pulling a thread from a beautiful tapestry of life. And if enough threads are pulled, then that tapestry will collapse and the ecosystem itself will collapse. And the wildlife trade is having a tremendous impact on biodiversity, certainly in Africa and China and some other countries too. And so it's very clear, isn't it, that we need somehow to build a new relationship with the natural world, a new relationship with animals. This has been mentioned by many speakers, but I just want to emphasize the sentience of animals and how it's changed since I first began working with chimpanzees back in 1960. And when I got to Cambridge University in 1961, I was told I could not talk about chimps having personalities, minds capable of problem solving, and above all emotions, because those were unique to us. Today we know it's not true. Today science has proved that animals are sentient beings. Today we know the remarkable intelligence, not just of great apes and elephants and dolphins, but of so many of the birds. And I'm sure many of you have seen my octopus teacher. We now know how amazingly intelligent the octopus is. And so every one of these wild animals that's trafficked, every one of the farm animals in these factory farms, each one is an individual. Each one has a personality. Each one is capable of feeling fear, terror, and pain. And I just have to emphasize that because I believe it is so terribly important. And this kind of empathy is moving us towards adopting plant-based diets in many parts of the world, which will save huge areas of the environment, which are currently cleared to grow grain to feed the animals, and as well as reducing animal suffering. I speak from the places I know best. In Africa, the wildlife trade is helped by the fact that so many people are living in poverty. The most trafficked animal in the world, the pangolin. And if some poor villager captures a pangolin and manages to sell it, that will probably feed his family for a week. We need to alleviate poverty because that is one of the drivers of animal trafficking at the basic low level. And of course, that villager will sell his animal to a trader who will probably sell it to a cartel. And as you all know, this wildlife trade is worth several $billion a year. So there's a huge incentive for people to capture these animals. And secondly, I want to emphasize the tremendous need, and this has also been mentioned before, but education. because so many people literally act cruelly through ignorance. They literally do not understand. And it was when the Jane Goodall Institute in Tanzania was trying to alleviate the poverty of local villagers by helping them find ways of surviving without destroying the environment and hunting, that I realized all our efforts are in vain if we're not educating the next generation to be better stewards of this planet than we have been and are being. And so we began our youth program, Roots and Shoots, which, by the way, is very strong in Italy. It involves young people of all ages, from kindergarten through university and beyond. And because everything's interrelated, each group chooses projects to help people, another one to help animals, another to help the environment. And I first went to China in 1995 and began Roots and Shoots there. It's all over the country now. And the last time I went to China 2 years ago, several adults came up to me and said, well, of course I care about animals. I was in Roots and Shoots in primary school. And so educating people to understand and to care, I think, is absolutely key. And Roots and Shoots in many countries is working on the wildlife trade. We have a group of university students who are doing everything that they can to push for legislation. And in Italy, working with the government to try and persuade the government to not only impose a ban, but to enforce a ban. And we all know that in some countries, even if a ban is in place, it's very difficult to enforce it. We all know that in some countries, the level of corruption is high, and that paying some dollars will enable you to smuggle an endangered species through. It's also really important to realize that in countries where they confiscate shipment illegally trafficked animals, what are they going to do with them if there isn't a good facility nearby where those animals can be looked after and hopefully sent back to the wild? So there's an awful lot of issues around this wildlife trade, and we need to tackle all of them. And yes, working on bans, as we've heard, can make a huge difference in Europe, in North America. But in other countries, the ban doesn't really serve that much good. And so there we need education, and we need the alleviation of poverty. So in China, we've worked very hard on educating people about, well, first of all, it was ivory and rhino horn to eliminate the demand. And now educating people on not only the ethics of killing and eating wild animals, but also the health risk. So we're in a crisis on the planet today. And this COVID-19 has woken people up. It's disrupting economies all around the world. And we brought it on ourselves. And it's exacerbated by loss of biodiversity and by climate change. So I think this is merely a call to compliment the speakers on the work that you're all doing, to encourage the Italian government to adopt and enforce this ban, to try to strengthen our Roots and Shoots program in Italy, which is under the Jane Goodall Institute. The executive director is Daniela Dodono, who's playing a very major role in working with the government on this ban in wildlife trafficking. So the hope for the future, because a lot of people have lost hope these days. I meet them all the time. That's why I just wrote a book called The Book of Hope, and people say, Jane, do you really have hope? Well, it's listening to people like you. That's a reason for hope. There are more people working really hard to address all these different problems. There are incredible, inspirational people tackling problems that seem impossible, and not giving up and inspiring others to join them. People taking action, young people all around the world in 65 countries with our program alone, and we work with many other youth groups, young people determined to end wildlife trafficking, determined to end factory farms. And this is really cause for hope for the future. So thank you for letting me say these few words. You can hear that I'm talking too much every day. It Zooms ever since the pandemic began. My voice keeps disappearing. But anyway, thank you again. And good luck, everyone in Italy working on this ban, and anybody else who may be working on some of the issues that I mentioned. Thank you.